The sun had just started to dip behind the quiet rows of townhouses in Crestwood Hills, a neighborhood known more for its manicured lawns and quarterly HOA meetings than for its diversity. Judge Maya Carter had just moved in 2 days earlier, unloading the last of her boxes herself, still dressed in a pair of worn jeans and an oversized hoodie from her alma mater, Howard University. Her natural curls were pulled into a high puff, and her hands were dusty from planting lavender in the front garden bed. She had always found peace in solitude and routine. After years on the bench, balancing law, politics, and public scrutiny, the idea of coming home to a quiet block with chirping birds and predictable neighbors had felt like a reward well earned. Until the knock. At first, she thought it was a delivery, maybe the bookshelf she'd ordered. But when she opened the door, it wasn't UPS. It was 2 uniformed police officers, standing with notepads out, guarded expressions already in place. "Ma'am," one began, scanning the front porch and the open moving boxes nearby, "we got a call about suspicious activity at this address." Maya raised an eyebrow, her heart rate not speeding up, just shifting into that familiar zone she reserved for courtroom crossfire. "Suspicious?" she asked calmly. "Yes, someone reported a possible break-in. Said you didn't seem to belong here." The word stung, not because it was new, but because it came dressed in polite tones and official protocol. Belong. As if home was something you had to look the part for. She stepped back slightly and retrieved her wallet from the kitchen counter, handing over her ID. "I'm the owner. Just moved in on Friday." The officer looked down at the card, then up at her. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite an apology, but a loosening of suspicion. "Thank you, Judge Carter," he said after reading the name. The other officer blinked. "You're a judge?" Maya nodded, silently. "District Court, downtown. Anything else?" The one who had done most of the talking cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. Sorry for the disturbance." As they turned to leave, she looked across the street, and saw him. A white man in his late 40s, standing on his porch with his arms folded, watching everything unfold like he had ordered it. She recognized him from the morning before, when she waved hello during her walk. He hadn't waved back. Now he just stared, his face unreadable. She didn't wave this time. She simply met his gaze, unwavering. No threats. No drama. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had survived far worse than being underestimated in a zip code. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment. Not even a full week in her new home, and already a reminder that status doesn't shield you from suspicion, not when your skin is black, your face is unfamiliar, and your presence challenges someone else's comfort. But she wasn't rattled. She didn't leave the bench because she was easily shaken. She simply picked up her watering can, walked back out to her lavender, and resumed tending to her soil. Let them watch, she thought. They'd know her name soon enough. The morning after the police incident, Maya rose early, as she always did. The sun had barely peeked above the rooftops, casting a dull gray light over the still sleeping street. She brewed her coffee strong, black, and stood in her kitchen by the wide front-facing window, watching the neighborhood quietly come to life. Joggers passed by in pairs. A paperboy tossed newspapers from his bike. Lawns shimmered with dew. Everything seemed ordinary, except for the tension that still hung in the air like fog. As she sipped, she saw him again. The man from across the street. He was walking his golden retriever, a routine she was beginning to clock, like the slow ticks of a neighborhood clock. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his awareness. The weight of it. People like him didn't need to speak hate to weaponize suspicion. It bled through in silence, in glances, in the long pauses after questions that never came. Maya stepped outside with her mug in hand, stood on the porch, and nodded politely in his direction. Nothing. Not a twitch of acknowledgement. Just the click of his dog's leash and the tap of his shoes on concrete. He kept walking. Maya breathed in deep and let the cold air settle in her lungs before turning to tend to her flowers again. Later that week, the mailman, an older white man with tired eyes, rang her doorbell with a package. "New neighbor?" he asked casually, handing her the box. "Yes," she replied. "Just moved in from Midtown." He squinted at her, then at the name on the box. "Judge Carter?" he said, surprised. She smiled. "That's me. I thought I recognized your face. You handled that gun law case last year, right?" She nodded again. "That was mine." The mailman grinned now. "My niece is in law school because of you. She saw your segment on the news." Maya's heart softened. "Tell her to keep going. We need her." As he walked off, Maya turned to see the same neighbor, Richard, as she had learned from the mailbox nameplate, standing at the edge of his lawn, watching. This time he looked confused. Suspicious again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, as the mailman drove off, he called out. "So, what do you do, exactly?" The words floated across the street like a dare. Maya stepped forward, not raising her voice, but not softening it either. "I'm the district judge for the 7th Circuit." Silence. Richard blinked. "Judge?" She nodded once. "That's right." He shifted uncomfortably, and his eyes narrowed, as if trying to place her in a new category, one that conflicted with the image he had already filed away in his mind. He didn't apologize. He didn't congratulate. Instead, after a beat, he muttered, "Didn't expect that," turned, and walked back into his house. Maya stood still for a moment. Not angry. Not surprised. She had seen this before, from defense attorneys, from executives in boardrooms, from people who only believed in her when they had no other choice. The robe had never shielded her from judgment. It had only made it harder for them to dismiss her openly. That evening, as the sky turned dusky pink, she took another walk, this time through the neighborhood loop. Some people smiled. Others stared. But no one asked her name. And that was the thing. Richard hadn't asked it either, not until the title forced it out. Not until she broke his assumption with credentials he couldn't ignore. But she was not her title. She was Maya. And it was never about the role, it was about being seen. She walked with her head high, shoulders relaxed, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she knew that dignity wasn't something you earned from others. It was something you chose to wear, like armor, in every room, on every sidewalk, and especially when no one asked who you were. The courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, heels clacked against marble floors, legal assistants carried armfuls of files, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from the vending station near the elevators. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. For most. But not for Richard. He entered the courthouse unassumingly, escorting a friend of his who was embroiled in a property dispute. Richard had lived in the city for years, but it was his first time stepping into a courtroom. He wore a charcoal gray blazer that didn't quite match his pants and an expression that wavered between boredom and misplaced confidence. His friend muttered nervously about the opposing counsel's tactics, but Richard reassured him with the kind of certainty that only comes from ignorance. "Relax," he said. "These judges don't care. They just move paper around." They didn't know who the judge was. Not yet. They sat in the back row, waiting for the clerk to call the session. Richard leaned back in his seat, legs spread comfortably, eyes scanning the room with detached curiosity. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and all rose as the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Maya Carter." Richard didn't react at first. He stood because everyone else did, distracted by a buzzing notification on his phone. But when he looked up, his eyes locked onto her. There she was, robed in black, composed, confident, walking toward the bench with the same calm presence she had the day he called the cops on her. Only this time, there was no hoodie, no garden hose in her hand, no quiet corner to hide his assumptions in. She wasn't the neighbor now. She was the authority in the room. He sat slowly, visibly stunned, as she adjusted the microphone and began the proceedings. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying that clear, unshakable tone of command honed by years of law and grace under fire. Richard couldn't look away. The courtroom was transformed by her presence, not just because she was in charge, but because every word she spoke revealed a depth of intellect and assurance that left no room for doubt. She recited case law without notes, asked sharp, surgical questions, and balanced firmness with fairness. Richard's friend nudged him and whispered, "You all right?" But Richard said nothing. He felt his face burn, not from guilt exactly, but from the dawning recognition that he had made a quiet fool of himself. The hearing proceeded. Maya addressed both parties with professionalism. If she recognized Richard, she didn't let it show. That was her power. She could command a courtroom and still keep her dignity sharp and untouched, even when someone like him had once tried to reduce her to a trespasser. Watching her work was like watching a current you hadn't known existed until it pulled you under. Every argument she dismantled, every statute she cited, every moment she held the room with nothing but her presence, it all chipped away at the assumptions Richard had built his life on. When the hearing ended, she rose, gavelled the room, and stepped back into her chambers with the same grace she had entered with. No fanfare. No need to linger. Outside the courtroom, Richard stood frozen in the hallway. His friend babbled about how the hearing had gone, but Richard didn't hear him. All he could think about was the woman in robes, the same woman whose flowers he had once sneered at across the street, the same woman he had never bothered to ask a name from. Now, he knew her name. Everyone in that room knew her name. And for the first time in a long time, Richard realized he hadn't just misjudged a person, he had misjudged the very idea of who belongs where. The flyer came folded and tucked into every mailbox on the street. Printed in bold font, it read, Crestwood Hills HOA Emergency Meeting, Community Safety Concerns. No details, no explanation, just an invitation thinly veiled as a warning. Maya found hers late in the evening, slipped between a stack of catalogs and utility bills. She read it once, then again. She'd seen this dance before, dressed up as policy but steeped in something colder. That Thursday evening, the clubhouse was full. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of uneasy bodies. Most of the residents arrived early, whispering in clusters near the lemonade table. The air was thick with anticipation and something more bitter than citrus. Maya arrived exactly on time. She wore a fitted gray blazer, wide-leg black slacks, and a single gold pin on her lapel, the scales of justice. Her posture was straight, her gaze calm, her step steady. She knew this stage, even if it wasn't a courtroom. They called the meeting to order with stiff smiles and carefully chosen words. There have been reports of unusual activity, the HOA president said, glancing at no one in particular, though his eyes flickered toward her. Concerns about strangers. And disturbances. Maya listened. She waited. She let them fumble through vague phrases about maintaining the culture of the community and preserving peace. One woman, who had never once returned Maya's wave during morning walks, raised her hand and said there were new energies in the neighborhood. Her voice trembled with the effort to sound polite. Then Richard spoke. Of course he did. I think we just need transparency, he said. I mean, we should all know who we're living next to, right? That was her cue. Maya stood slowly. The room turned. Conversation stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. My name, she said, is Judge Maya Carter. I am the sitting district court judge for the 7th Circuit. I have lived here for 3 weeks. I bought my home legally, with money I earned from a career built on decades of service to the law. I pay taxes. I water my lawn. I say good morning to people who never say it back. No one moved. I've presided over cases involving billion-dollar corporations and wrongful convictions. I've defended victims, sentenced abusers, and been confirmed unanimously by your elected officials. I have been vetted more times than I can count. But apparently, I needed to be vetted again because I planted flowers on my porch in a hoodie. A man coughed. A woman looked down at her shoes. I know what this meeting is, Maya continued. It's not about noise or safety. It's about control. And discomfort. Encoded language wrapped in community newsletters. Silence. I will not be leaving. I will not be apologizing for existing. And I will not allow any of you to pretend this is anything other than what it is. Her voice didn't waver. Her spine didn't bend. And when she sat down, the room was different. It wasn't hers, but it wasn't theirs in the way they had believed it was either. Not anymore. The meeting ended early. No vote was taken. No action passed. The lemonade table stood untouched. And as Maya walked out into the night air, she didn't look back, not because she didn't care what they thought, but because she already knew. By the next morning, the entire block buzzed beneath the surface. Not openly, of course, Crestwood Hills was too polished for anything so uncivil as direct confrontation, but in quiet glances, altered tones, and the way conversation stopped just a second too late when Maya walked past. The HOA meeting had shaken something loose. Not in her, she had long since built her armor, but in them. Their certainty. Their silent codes. Their illusion of quiet dominance. At the local cafe near the intersection, Maya sipped her espresso alone. She had brought a legal brief with her, planning to spend an hour reviewing upcoming hearings. But she hadn't turned the first page when the barista, a young white woman with nervous hands, walked over and said, I just wanted to say. I saw the HOA recording. You were incredible. Maya looked up slowly, surprised. Thank you, she said with measured warmth. The barista hesitated. My mom's on the board. She said you made people uncomfortable. But in a good way. A smile tugged at the corner of Maya's lips. Truth usually does. Later that day, while tending her front yard, gloves on, soil beneath her fingernails, she noticed Richard walking his dog again. He paused at the edge of his driveway. She didn't look up. She didn't stop what she was doing. But this time, he spoke first. "I didn't know who you were," he said, not quite an apology, but close enough to one in his world. Maya stood, wiped her hands on a towel, and finally met his eyes. "You didn't care who I was," she replied. He nodded once. A small, grim gesture. "Maybe." Silence stretched between them, thicker than the hedge that divided their properties. Then, surprising both of them, Richard said, "You were right. At the meeting." He looked down at his shoes. "We hide it better these days. That's all." Maya didn't respond with comfort. She wasn't there to absolve him. Instead, she asked, "And now that you know, will you do anything different?" He didn't answer. But a week later, she noticed a change. A black teenager on a skateboard zoomed through the neighborhood, something that would have normally sparked a passive-aggressive HOA email, and no one said a word. The next month, the HOA newsletter dropped its coded language about preserving community standards and instead included an article about equity and neighborhood safety practices, anonymous, but Maya could guess who had influenced it. Things didn't transform overnight. This wasn't a fairy tale. The racism didn't vanish, the judgment didn't disappear. But there was a shift. A crack in the glass. A space where silence had once ruled, and now awareness lived. Maya hadn't moved to Crestwood Hills to be a symbol, a lesson, or a story. She moved for peace. But if her presence unsettled the norms enough to make someone think twice before calling the cops on someone who looked like her, then maybe the move had been worth more than peace. Maybe it had planted something deeper, like truth, or accountability. And those things, she knew, always took root slow. But once they did, they changed the landscape forever. The video from the HOA meeting, shaky, grainy, filmed from a phone halfway tucked into someone's handbag, hit the internet by accident. At least, that's what the original poster claimed. But intention didn't matter once it began to spread. First it made its way through local neighborhood forums. Then it landed on a viral TikTok channel that specialized in powerful real-life moments. From there, it ignited. By the end of the week, the video of Judge Maya Carter standing calmly in a sea of uncomfortable faces had been viewed over 2 million times. Clips of her declaration, "I will not be apologizing for existing," appeared over inspirational music. Edits showed her planting flowers in fast motion, walking confidently into court, and standing silently while white neighbors stared with barely hidden disapproval. She became a symbol, not just of success, but of composure under pressure, of grace sharpened into resistance. And yet, Maya didn't watch any of it. Her inbox overflowed. Law students from across the country sent emails titled "Thank you and I needed this today." Journalists reached out for interviews. A morning show offered to fly her to New York for an Inspiring Woman of the Week segment. She declined. Politicians tweeted about her. Someone even started a petition for her to run for office. She ignored it. Because Maya knew the difference between being heard and being used. She hadn't spoken that night to go viral. She hadn't moved to Crestwood Hills to be anyone's icon. She was a judge. A woman. A neighbor. And for once, she just wanted her life to be hers, not a headline. Still, things changed. Strangers waved to her at the grocery store. A middle-aged white woman approached her in the produce aisle and whispered, "My daughter showed me your video. I didn't know. I'm sorry." Maya nodded kindly but kept moving. A young black boy biking through the neighborhood stopped in front of her house one afternoon and said, "You're famous, huh?" She smiled. Only for doing what was right. He grinned and rode off. And yet, even as the world around her adjusted its gaze, Maya remained steady. She understood that attention didn't always equal change, that being visible wasn't the same as being respected. But maybe, just maybe, all that noise outside would force the silence inside Crestwood Hills to finally break. Not because she yelled, but because she refused to be small. Spring crept into Crestwood Hills slowly, as if unsure it was welcome. But eventually, the trees filled with soft green, the air warmed, and the gardens, especially Maya's, burst into color. Her roses were in full bloom, defiant and brilliant, rising like little suns from the soil she had once been told she didn't belong to. It had been 6 months since she moved in. 6 months since the police were called. Since the meeting. Since the viral wave that painted her face across timelines and comment sections. And now? Now the neighborhood was quiet in a different way. Less suspicious. More watchful. People waved. Not all, but many. The change wasn't perfect, but it was real. Maya stood on her porch one Sunday morning, coffee in hand, when a young black girl, no more than 9 or 10, walked by with her parents. The girl stopped in front of the flowers, wide-eyed. "Are these yours?" she asked. Maya nodded. "Every one." The girl looked up at her. "You live here?" Maya smiled gently. "Yes. I do." The girl turned to her mother and whispered, "See? I told you she looked like a judge." Her mother laughed softly, eyes locking with Maya's in a moment of shared understanding that needed no words. When they continued down the sidewalk, Maya sat on the porch steps and let the morning settle. Later that week, the local high school invited her to speak at their graduation. She said yes. She wore deep navy robes instead of black that day, not because it was tradition, but because it was hers. She spoke of justice, yes, but also of endurance. Of how even silent battles leave scars. Of the strength it takes to stay when the world tries to move you out of frame. And in the front row, Richard sat with his wife, listening. He wasn't a changed man. But he was, at least, a man trying to understand. As Maya returned home that night, the neighborhood lights glowing behind curtains and trees, she passed her flowers, now overgrown, wild with color. She didn't trim them back. She let them grow. Because what had bloomed here was more than roses. It was proof. Of presence. Of resistance. Of grace. And of a legacy that wouldn't wilt just because it made people uncomfortable. Crestwood Hills had wanted her gone. Now it grew around her.